All right. And with that being said, it's now time to introduce Miss Rosalinda del Castillo, who is portraying Ramona, who hosted author Helen Hunt Jackson in her home prior to Jackson's authoring the book Ramona. And Ramona was married to Lewis Wolfe. The Wolfes ran the Temecula Post Office, General Store, Hotel. Lewis Wolfe was also a road commissioner and a justice of the peace between the late 1860s and the 1890s. Ramona?
Good evening. I just want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight. As you can see, first of all, I have brought quite a bit of notes with me. That is because I have experienced much in this valley. Much happiness, sadness, worry, exhaustion, pride, exhilaration, loss, comfort, and love. So, because I would like to share it accurately as well as I can, I will be looking down at my notes from time to time. I hope you don't mind. Also, I've been battling just a small cough this last week, so I hope you'll bear with me. Okay, so I'm Ramona Wolfe. My husband was the late, as you know, the late Lewis Wolfe, and we lived here in Temecula for over 20 years. Well, can you believe it? It's 1890, just 3 years since the death of my dear Lewis. Anyway, well, let me formally introduce myself to you. My full name is Maria Antonia Ramona Wolfe. But everyone calls me both. So can you. Let me tell you a bit about my childhood. My father was born in the West Indies, and he worked as a cook on a whaling ship. He prepared and served all of the meals daily for the entire crew. And my father once told me that when the ship docked near land, the crew would actually go ashore and catch these large land turtles and bring them back to the ship. And then he said the turtles would roam freely on the deck, minding their own business, until the day their luck ran out. And they were selected for the evening meal. Evidently, turtle soup seemed to be a specialty for the entire crew. Eventually, that whaling ship docked at the port in Santa Barbara, California, where my father first soon met my mother. My mother's name is Maria Apollonia, and she was of Indian descent from the Chumash people. Now, Santa Barbara is the capital of the Chumash world, which extends from Mission San Fernando from the south to Mission San Luis Obispo to the north. I was born in Santa Barbara. My people lived on that land for over 15,000 years. And an interesting fact about the Chumash is that we are a patriarchal society, which means that our lineage is traced from the mother's side of the family. And so either a man or a woman could be chosen as a tribal chief. My mother was a very proud and strong woman. I could easily see her as a tribal chief, although that never came to pass. I'm the oldest of 3 children. I have a brother, William, and a sister, Isabella. While we were still very young, we were placed with an English-speaking family by the name of MacDonald, and they became our legal guardians. And while we lived with them, we were taught to speak English at an early age, which has served me well. But I have to tell you how it is terribly sad that it is that we never learned what happened to our parents after that. And it's still a mystery to me. My husband, Louis, was of Jewish descent, and he was born in the area of the border of France and Germany. He emigrated to the United States in the 1850s, along with many other men who heard about the great California gold rush. Eventually, Louis settled in Southern California, where we were married in 1865. And I was all 19 years old, and Louis was 32. At the time, Louis was working for Mr. Brady at his store. We were living near Warner Springs, and soon after, our children began to arrive. My oldest son was Albert, who was born in October 1865, the same year we were married. Excuse me, from time to time I'll need to just cough. Okay, for some years it seemed that my husband, well, he couldn't quite settle down. Honestly, we were constantly moving from place to place, and then back again. He was always a good provider, though, but he needed to be constantly on the move. He was a very ambitious man. I'm sure he would deny it, but I think Louis suffered from a condition commonly known as wanderlust. The early years of our marriage were, well, quite difficult, actually. I remember a terrible event that happened the first year we were married. I had a friend named Ledesky Kimball. She and her husband, Cyrus, had a young child, and they lived near Warner's ranch. Cyrus owned a very nice general store that did quite well. But in June, a man who worked for Cyrus was murdered. And then, just a few months later, Cyrus and another man were murdered right in front of their children and their wives. It was devastating. Lodesky became a widow with a young child and another on the way. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Fortunately, in the summer of 1867, Louis and I moved from Warner's Ranch to the Temecula Valley because it was an opportunity that opened up for us to own our own store. Louis began managing the store in an adobe building located in the west side of the Immigrant Trail, actually not far from here. And then Louis later purchased that store and the land on it, and it sat for it sold for $1,000, and the area is called the Little Temecula Ranchero. But believe me, there's nothing little about it. It consists of 2,000 200 acres. And then I and Lewis, we began stocking items in the store that were needed by all the local families and the Temecula Indians. We both worked equally very hard. And by the way, there's a picture of our store right over here that you can see. It's not far from here. You can walk to it. We were very proud of it. When we purchased the land in 1868, there were a number of Temecula Indians living on the property. In particular, Maria Apish and family members were living there along with other friends in their tribe. Unfortunately, Lewis and other newcomers didn't want them there. He tolerated them. He tolerated their presence for a few years. But how shall I say this? The truth is, on a sad day in 1875, Lewis went to the sheriff, and they hired a posse, and they drove them off our property. They roughly drove them off with their livestock and the belongings they could carry, dumping them just past our property line. Luckily, no one was killed as far as I know of. But fortunately, just past our property line lived Judge McGee, who received them and allowed them to live on that property as long as they needed to. After the eviction, Indian activist Helen Hunt Jackson visited Temecula and went to Washington, D.C. to urge Congress to set aside nearby land just for the Temecula Indians. And that land is now the Pichanga Reservation, which was established in 1882. By this time, we owned about 2,000 head of sheep, some horses, a few cows, some chickens. Our store was known as the Wolf Store, and it quickly became the main gathering place in the community, since the main trail, the only trail leading to San Diego, conveniently passed right by my front door. Good for business. The Temecula Creek runs the south side of our property, so there's lots of wildlife in the area. We have deer, mountain lions, bobcats, rabbits, squirrels, not to mention rattlesnakes. Life was good. We had an excellent well on the property. That was a blessing. For a time, the store served as the local post office, and all of our mail for Temecula was brought 3 times a week. We had great service. And it was brought by stagecoach or on horseback. Everyone knew when the stagecoach would arrive, so our store would be full of neighbors waiting for the mail or any news at all. Lewis also added some guest rooms along both sides of the store and went to and we rented to travelers who were passing through. And we rented for only 50 cents a night, and 50 cents for food, and 50 cents if you needed your horses watered. Fortunately, we were able to employ a Chinese gentleman by the name of Samsing, who did most of the cooking for our family and my guests. That was helpful because I had so many children. Lewis was a smart businessman, and during his life he served as a merchant, a postmaster, a road commissioner, a school board trustee, and justice of the peace. And our store even served as a polling place during election years. Lewis was an active member of the Democratic Central Committee, and we even hosted a senatorial convention in our home. He was without a doubt the best known pioneer in the entire valley. And by the way, I have a photograph that was taken of Lewis and me in the 1880s, and I'd like to pass it around for you to see. And, oh, here it is. Just pass it around. Okay. Our family also grew very quickly. I truly enjoyed my children, but I did have my hands full. We had 8 children, 8 of them in total. Sadly, 3 of our children didn't make it past childhood. It's so hard to bear. But I had to make myself strong for our other 5 children. And thank goodness I still have the rest of my 5 children. Then in March 1882, we received a visit from the author Helen Hunt Jackson, and she stayed with us several days. When I introduced myself, I recall her saying, "Ramona, what a beautiful name. I will call my book Ramona." Well, Mrs. Jackson has since become a well-known writer, and her novel, Ramona, put Temecula on the map. In all honesty, though, I have to confess that the main character, Ramona, is really not based on myself. In fact, it's based on 3 different stories of Native people. However, if you read the book, and it's a good book, one chapter, Mrs. Jackson refers to a German storekeeper with his half-Indian wife, a Mr. and Mrs. Hartzell, who owned a general store, guess where? In Temecula. Well, I don't know about you, but those characters sound very familiar to me. Anyway, she was a very entertaining guest. She told us about her travels throughout the country. She also asked me to take her to visit the local Temecula Indians. There she noticed that the women were very proficient in making lace. Well, when she got back home, she began ordering lace products from them through me, providing the native ladies some extra business money. By this time, our store was doing quite well. Our 2,200-acre Little Temecula Rancho had recently been valued at $100,000. Then another exciting event happened in 1882. It was the arrival of the California Southern Railroad. Now, when Lewis heard that the railroad was coming to Temecula, he came up with what he described as a grand idea. His plan was for the railroad and the train depot to be located on our property. Then Lewis was going to modestly name the town Louisville. Well, unfortunately for us, the railroad took another route, one that was closer to the Marietta Creek, so the town of Louisville never happened. By September 1883, there was regular railroad service to Temecula, and that event prompted a lot of commercial growth near the new train depot in the center of town, and we called it New Temecula. So Lewis quickly purchased land to farm on Main Street in the middle of town. Although our business was doing quite well, but I noticed we had a number of creditors. So I took it upon myself to file a homestead exemption document with the court in San Diego. This would protect our personal residence and keep it safe from future claims regarding Lewis's many business deals. And I protected it from my family especially, and I'm so glad I did. And true to form, Lewis built a new general store on Main Street, and we advertised the old Adobe store for sale, and it was going for sale. But then you probably remember a month later. Do you remember the torrential rains that hit us? Oh my gosh. There was a lot of flooding in the area, and in fact, it rained over 20 inches in one 24-hour period. We were lucky that our new store was unharmed, but the Adobe store suffered severe water damage. It was around this time, I thought about not mentioning this, but you probably have read it in the newspapers already. But, so I figured you might as well hear it from me, get the truth. One day in the spring, 1881, when I was driving my horse and buggy through town on some business, through Newtown, I was accidentally thrown from the buggy. Now, I don't know if it was the horse's fault or my own fault, but it seemed that the horse went left, I went right, I flew off that buggy and plop right in the mud in front of my neighbors, my friends. There I was. So embarrassing. It took me a few minutes to gather my wits about me and get back on the buggy. I wasn't seriously hurt, but my pride was badly injured. And wouldn't you know, news travels fast, because in only 3 days later, there was an article in the San Diego newspaper. You got it. With a bold headline that read, "Ramona Wolf in a buggy accident." So embarrassing. Anyway, you heard from me. In February 1884, Lewis began a new partnership with a young man named Mac Machado. This young man, Mac, he invested $5,000 in the partnership, and together Lewis and Mac established the Wolf Machado Company. I'm sure you're well acquainted with it. In February 1884, Mac, who was a young, energetic, and eager to learn, he was exactly the business partner that Lewis needed. Whether Lewis wanted to admit it or not, but because after partnering with Machado, Lewis built us a new home in town as well. So it was about the same time that Lewis began heavily investing in the ocean port community of Oceanside. He ordered shiploads of grain and other items that were needed in the store. Supplies were being sent by steamship all the way from San Francisco to Oceanside. I recall one order where the Wolf and Machado Company ordered 20,000 sacks of grain, and it took 3 teams of 6 horses, each pulling 3 wagons filled with supplies to get them from Oceanside to our store out here in Temecula. Just a few days later, Lewis placed another order for 40 tons of flour from the Paula Mills made from his friend Brady's wheat. Then extra workers were needed in the area, and the landowners would ask Lewis to find half a dozen men or so to help them with harvesting crops or handling the livestock or what have you. So often men were standing around our store waiting for an offer for a day's work, and they frequently found work. Everything seemed to be going so well, and our business was thriving. We had a lot of regular customers who we knew we could depend on to place orders every few weeks for the supplies they needed for their ranches and their homes. But wouldn't you know it, just as I was feeling happy and secure in my life, everything started to fall apart. By the spring of 1887, Lewis and Mac were suing each other in court over various business disagreements. There were many arguments between them. Then lawsuits were filed, and then counter lawsuits were filed. It was crazy. It was nerve-wracking. It went on for 6 months. In September, both Lewis and Mac Machado appeared before a judge at the San Diego County Courthouse. After his court appearance, Lewis loaded up his wagon with fresh supplies and headed out of San Diego for the very last time. Only 2 days later, quite unexpectedly, Lewis suddenly died. Now granted, I knew he was up in age, he was up in years. He was 54 years old, but everyone who knew him was stunned because he was such an active, vibrant man. I can't be certain, but I believe that he suffered a heart attack. My youngest, Ricardo, was only 3 years old. It was quite a shock. Lewis's body is buried on a hilltop in Temecula along with several children that we lost. Our family prospered for many years, and our children were happy growing up in this valley. After Lewis's death, our property was valued for $1.4 million. We were, at the time, the wealthiest family in the Temecula Valley. Still, my life and my children's lives changed dramatically. I find myself involved in a number of lawsuits regarding Lewis's businesses. Not surprisingly, there were a number of business associates who filed claims to much of our money. Ultimately, most of Lewis's businesses have either been sold or dissolved. Fortunately, my son and my nephew are still running our store here in town. In closing, as I look back over my life, I realize that Lewis and I had quite an adventure. In spite of all that has happened, I still have many happy memories, though, of our time together here. I feel fortunate to have had these years with my family, whom I treasure in the Temecula Valley. And I hope to have many more years to come. Excuse me. I still have our home here in town, and several of my children are living with me, so that gives me great comfort. I hope I've given you a glimpse of what life is like here in the late 1800s, and if you have questions, I will do my best to answer them. Okay, I'm not a character now, I'm me, okay, so, won't blow your mind. Okay, so, and also, Rebecca, okay, Rebecca also offered her services also to refer to me if I don't know any answers, so I've got the big guns here, I've got Rebecca, you know. Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you for Ramona for informing us about your background, and you just performed the 100th anniversary of the Ramona show in Henry, California.
Okay.
We have 15,000 participants.
Well,
So we love you for giving us inspiration.
oh,
We have 350 actors, probably 100 Indians, 50 cowboys, 100 different Spanish dancers. And so we had a great turnout this year, it's the 100th anniversary, and we hope all of you can come next year.
it's beautiful. I've been to it. It's amazing. You do a beautiful job.
So what is your name, sir?
Mark Morgan,
And what part do you play?
we run the Spanish dancers.
Awesome.
Ooh.
You're wonderful. How many of you are here tonight from the Ramona pageant? Awesome. Thank you. Miss Ramona, I don't know, I may have not heard. Did you tell about your demise?
Well, I was waiting for somebody to ask that question. You've noticed that I was coughing, okay? I don't have COVID, okay? I want you to know that. The reason I was coughing is that 4 years later, she did die in 1894. She was, I believe she was only 48 years old at the time. She died of consumption, which is tuberculosis. And so Rebecca told me that a few years before that you start having those symptoms, I think. I've never had tuberculosis, so I don't know, but thank goodness. But
We looked it up. It was about 5 years.
oh, okay, so there you have it. That's why I was coughing. But I needed the water because I was dry. Okay.
Where is Ramona buried? Not with Lewis, right?
Ah, good question.
Yes.
Well, she was initially born, strike that. She was initially buried in San Luis Rey Mission out here in Oceanside. But I heard from Rebecca that when they extended the freeway or the highway, whatever is in front, a lot of the bodies they did not dig up. And it is our belief, anyway, that she's under the highway. It sucks.
So there's a difference in where the two were buried, because we had a sanctified Catholic cemetery over here that's in front of Killarney's, where many of the people from the Temecula Massacre, which was part of the Mexican-American War, were buried. But Lewis couldn't be buried there because he was Jewish. So he created his own burial spot on the hill. And the question is whether or not the children are actually buried there. We don't know. But their names are etched on the granite that is on his sarcophagus and marker. And then she was Catholic, and so she was buried. The records were found at one time by somebody who was doing research, and then they were lost again. But the recollection is that it was, as Ramona said, under what's now the highway.
Yes? Well, I believe we met Morgan, too. Rebecca met them.
Okay, so there, of all the descendants of Lewis and Ramona Wolf, they had children who grew up, and the only ones who had children who survived were from a Pechanga woman that Lewis Jr., I'm going to say, mated with. They weren't legally married. So Lewis Wolf Jr. had one child, and if you know any of the people at Pechanga, the Pico descendants are descended from him, from Lewis and Ramona. And then we know, I can't think of their last name right now, but we know Morgan and Amy, and they have two brothers who I haven't met. So the only descendants that Lewis and Ramona Wolf have are Pechanga natives.
So
They're still here at the reservation.
And that's interesting that you mentioned that he made it. That is one thing, I've told you some negative things about Lewis Wolf, but I think I believe in seeing a human being balanced. Okay, we all have good and bad. He was interesting. He was of Jewish descent, and I was reading that in that time, he would have been, in the Jewish community, he would have been the creme of the creme, because I believe the Jewish community, if they were from France or Germany, they had money. They were top notch. Where if you were a Jewish person from Poland, let's say, I think they would have been further down the ladder. So what I'm saying is that he could have had any woman, any Jewish woman he wanted. And he had, he was thriving, and he didn't do that. He came to America. He could have had a mail order bride. He didn't do that. He did marry Ramona, and there's marriage certificate. I think they took it out in Los Angeles, I think in LA. And so he did marry her. He was a good provider. He stayed with her, supported the children. I think that's something to be said in a time that many of the pioneers were not bothering to marry Native American women. So I just thought I should say that. Yes. What happened to the land for Ramona? The lawsuits. That's what I'm talking about. The end. There were a lot of creditors. I think Rebecca, that didn't he have a lot of, we call them creditors, didn't he have a lot of loans, I think? That's my...
I really can't speak to that. I
Oh,
don't know if there's
okay.
anybody else who can, but You're sitting on his land.
Oh,
So it eventually became one of the land grants that Walter Vail purchased.
okay.
One of the 4 contiguous land grants. And so the reason this building is named the Little Temecula History Center is because there's nothing else in the valley that commemorates the Little Temecula Rancho. So it's like from, I don't know, Temecula Creek in over toward Walmart. Before Walmart, we're passing into another rancho. And across the street, that's another rancho. And then it goes down. So imagine kind of like a little children's house, only kind of more rectangular than square. That's the shape of it. And it's like here and down there.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to mention, I read a really interesting book called American Gold. It's an autobiography of this woman's family. And many of the storekeepers and many of the people that helped settle the West started out as Jewish peddlers.
Uh-huh.
They went on to become like pillars of the community. And I forget, it's American Ghost, and it's set in Santa Fe when it was just like a little adobe town.
Uh-huh.
And the author is something like Nordstrom or Nordhoff, and
Oh, okay.
really good. So
Oh,
that's
great.
my-
Great. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that.
Could you pass it up? Yeah. Good.
I wanted to mention, yeah, it's interesting that we have at the Temecula Valley Museum 2 letters from Helen Jackson to Ramona Wolf,
Yes.
and it's you can
Yes.
we had them in the Temecula Valley Museum board. We had them under the security, what do you call it, in the bank. Yeah, safety deposit box. I couldn't think of the word, in the bank, but we have taken it out now, and it's at the Temecula Museum, so you could go and actually see those.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
We would- Okay, so there's. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I can't hear you. Okay.
When Earl Stanley Garden had this ranch out there, was that previous owned by the Lewis Wolf?
Yes.
I do.
Yes. Oh, it was? Yes. I love it.
We're up on Rosalinda where Lewis Wolf's tomb or mausoleum is. Is that still considered legal burying ground? Was it ever a legal burying ground?
Well, yes, I think he set it up that way. Roger, what did the tax records say?
Yes, we pay taxes on that property as a cemetery every year, but it's very little. I think like $50 or something a year in property tax because it's a legal cemetery.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, we're done.